What I have for you this morning is no self-help book. I will not give you a list of 5 ways to make your life better, unfortunately. I will not be able, I may not even be able to give you something that makes you feel all rosy and peachy and wonderful and charges you up for your entire life. I'm not going to promise any of those things, but I am going to do some bragging. And the bragging that I'm going to do has really nothing to do with me and everything to do with the beauty of Jesus. And I use that word very specifically, the beauty of Jesus. Let me ask you if this sounds a little bit familiar. There was a city a long time ago that was on a very major thoroughfare. You might even call it a major interstate. It was situated on this major interstate. And as a result of being situated there, the world was constantly passing through it. With the world passing through, it was dropping off its wealth and its privilege, and the city grew strong and powerful and basically became a place that you could go for a pretty easy life. It was easy to find a job there. It was easy to get what you needed. And as a result of having everything that they needed and not really having to worry too much about their day-to-day survival, ideas started to become the main focus. Now, surrounded by all of these ideas and all these worldviews, there was a church that was planted in this town. But this church was not started by some superstar apostle. It probably wouldn't have been started by somebody whose name that you would recognize. Just an average, everyday guy that showed up at this relatively affluent city and started a church there. And it was a church filled with people whose ideas reflected their culture, who were influenced by those thoughts and views. And as this church began to grow, one of the key problems that it faced was that these ideas from the outside culture were influencing the way that everybody thought. Ideas about how to make money, how to spend money, how to spend their time. What should they be doing with themselves? And these crowded minds created a noise that had a tendency to distract them from Jesus. This city was known as Colossae. There's a letter written to them. You probably recognize the book Colossians. That's where we're going to read. I want you to open up Colossians, and hopefully in this brief description that I've given you of this church that was here, you might be able to see how similar the church at Colossae is to Sierra Bible Church. On the main interstate of 80, it's surrounded by a life of ease, where as a result of us not having to worry about being hunter-gatherers on a daily basis, we basically get to enjoy ourselves and think about some things from time to time. Paul and his message that he gave to the Colossians, if he was here, I would tell you he would probably want to give us the same message this morning. It's a message bragging about Jesus. Through all the noise, through all the loudness of the ideas that surround you, Paul wants to bring us back to Jesus. Let's stand together as we have a custom of doing as we focus on the main passage that we're going to read in Colossians. We're going to focus on Colossians chapter 1, starting in verse 13. Colossians 1:13 says this: He has delivered us from the domain of darkness and transferred us to the kingdom of his beloved Son, in whom we have redemption, the forgiveness of sins. He is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. For by him all things were created, in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities. All things were created through him. Yes, Theo, yes. All things were created through him and for him. And he is before all things, and in him all things hold together. He is the head of the body, the church. He is the beginning, the firstborn from the dead, that in everything he might be preeminent. For in him all the fullness of God was pleased to dwell, and through him to reconcile to himself all things, whether on earth or in heaven, making peace by the blood of his cross. Jesus, we praise you because you are beautiful. We praise you because you are wonderful. We give you this time, and we ask that you would fill us with a true sense of your greatness. Amen. You can be seated. Here's what I want to do. Nothing fancy, nothing tricky. I don't have a bunch of fun stories for you. Full refund for your price of admission if you do not enjoy what it is that we're about to hear. The point that I wanted to do was this. You know, Jesse actually asked me probably 7 weeks ago now, if I would speak. That's a long time to be thinking about a message. And as I sat there thinking, what is it that I wanted to do? I couldn't come up with an answer. But I was reading Colossians at the time, and I couldn't help but realize how beautiful Jesus looked in that book. How powerful Jesus looked in that book. And as things in my life got a little bit tumultuous, where I found encouragement was not by looking at those things and trying to worry about how to navigate through them. It was by fixing my eyes on Jesus and his greatness and what he was going to do with those things where I found encouragement. I hope that that's what will happen with you as we dive in. Let's look at verse 13. Verse 13 says, who, and this is a reference back to verse 12, the Father, talking about the Father, who has delivered us from the authority of darkness and made us stand in the kingdom of his Son, whom he loves. We're reminded here in verse 13 that there's only two teams. There isn't a neutral ground here when it comes to it. You're on one of two teams. If you have aligned yourself with Jesus, who has made a way for you to be on his team, good news, you're on the winning team. Anything else that you might have done puts you on the other team. Because we needed to be delivered from the authority of darkness. Whether or not you know it, there is a power that is at work in this world that is trying to take people away from Jesus. Are you aware of this? Bad news, friends. Bad news. When you walk out that door, shoot, inside this door even, there might be little things that enemy is trying to do to pull you away from Jesus. But the good news is he has made us to stand in his kingdom by his Son, whom he loves. God, almost if you want to think about it this way, God is sending spies into the darkness and pulling people back from that power. How is this done? The manner by which it's done is redemption, in whom we have redemption. I like that word redemption as I was studying it. That word redemption probably could be best captured by the idea of a payment of bail. I don't know if you've ever been in a situation in which you've needed to pay bail or paid bail for someone else. I hope you have not. It's not a fun situation to find yourself. This whole unreasonable bail thing, those numbers are pretty high in the unreasonable situations. We're talking numbers of tens, 20s, 30s, $50,000 sometimes, just at the beginning when you were accused of something. Here's what's beautiful about the picture here, though. It's not that it was declared that we didn't do anything wrong. It's that we were bailed out after we did it. We have payment of bail, redemptive forgiveness. What's the means by this? Or who is the means by which this happens? Verse 15. This is done by the image this is done by the Son, who is the image of God, who is the God who is unseen and invisible. You remember the story when Moses asks to see God? He's finally now comfortable enough in God's presence that he's like, hey, I want to see a little bit. And God's like, what's he say? No, no. Bad idea, right? Like a kid wanting to drink bleach was the idea of, hey, I want to see God. Moses is insistent. I want to see you. Let me just see a little bit. He's like, okay, here's what we can do. I can hide you in this rock where you will be completely, basically, I'm going to put you in a bomb shelter, and I'm going to pass by, and as I'm passing by, you'll get a little bit of a glimpse of my glory. Not see me directly. No. But you'll get a little bit of a glimpse of my glory. God follows through with the plan. Do you remember what happens when Moses goes back down the hill after this encounter? He's got such a bad sunburn from being in the bomb shelter where he was protected from the glory of God that the people of Israel are going, "Get away from us! Put a bag over your head. We can't handle." What is it they couldn't handle? It wasn't God's glory. It was the reflection of God's glory that had shone through Moses' face. Friends, you can't see God. Remember that the next time you're sitting there going, "God, why don't you just make yourself apparent in this situation?" Because you probably couldn't handle it. Good news for us, though. God came up with a plan and came in human form. The image of God now was seen in the firstborn of all creation. Now, this word firstborn might have a tendency initially to kind of throw you off, because when you think firstborn, you might think, okay, well, there's a little bit of an issue here. If Jesus has always been God, in what way is he the firstborn? This word here is prototokos, which is where we have adapted our word prototype. We're starting to get more and more used to that word as car makers are putting out prototypes all the time. We're like, "Hey, this is the version of the car we're about to make. Are y'all interested in it?" And that's what a prototype ends up being. The prototype shows that this is what could be. This is what we want you to see when we want you to see the fullness of what our intention and our plan is. Jesus was that prototype. Not created, but the firstborn, the prototokos, in the sense of position and sovereignty. If you've ever been in the unfortunate position of having your parents die, who typically is the person that's put in charge of the will? The firstborn, right? Not necessarily because of anything that the firstborn did, but it's kind of generally accepted in our culture that that's going to be the one that's going to carry the authority of the family after the parents are removed from the scene. Not firstborn in the sense of procreation, but firstborn in the sense of position and in power, in sovereignty. Now, Paul even recognized as he was writing this text that this might throw them off. This word might throw them off. So the next verse starts with the word because. In your version, in verse 16, it doesn't necessarily show the word because there, but the word that's actually there in the Greek is because. Paul is going to explain what he means by referring to Jesus as the firstborn. Let's look at this explanation. It starts with because, explaining how Jesus is the sovereign one. How? Here is the point at which we are going to work through a little bit of an exercise, okay? I hope that your vocal cords are warmed up. When I was a kid, there was a show called Pee-wee's Playhouse. I know it has kind of fallen from grace since then, unfortunately. All the mighty fall at some point. But the point of bringing up Pee-wee's Playhouse is that part of Pee-wee's Playhouse was an interactive cartoon. And one of the best parts of Pee-wee's Playhouse is that in every episode, there was a secret word. And when that secret word was said at some point in the episode, it was your job as the watcher of the episode to go, "Ah!" Now, good news. You will not have to do that. However, our phrase from this point forward in our message, our secret word, is all things. Because from this point in the text, I don't know if you noticed it when we read it, I tried to emphasize it with my voice. 7 times in the next 4 verses, the phrase all things is used. If a word or phrase is used 7 times in 4 verses, do you think Paul wants us to get it? Yes is the answer to that question, just in case you're a little bit slow like me. So, in order to fully emphasize the all things, anytime you hear me say all things, what you're going to do is say back to me all things. Okay, that's it. No pee-wee, just all you have to do is all things, okay? So let's try this. If I say the word all things, good. And how many of things is that? It's all things. That wasn't quite as strong as the first one. I actually mean this. All things. Good. Good. Now we're ready. Now we're equipped. As Paul goes to explain how Jesus is the firstborn, he starts with this because. And in verse 16 says, because in him were originated or created all things. So good. Keep it up. Don't lose heart. In heaven and on earth, that which you can see, that which you can't see, whether thrones or lordships or rulers or authorities, all things through the means of him and for him were they, and the word there for created is they were originated, they found their beginning, they find their underpinning, all things. That's a lot of things. All power, all authority, everything by him and through him. Let's go to verse 17. He is before or earlier stands before all things. And all things in him are held together. And that word there is built in such a way that it says he props them up. He makes them capable of standing. For those of you that have had the honor and the glory of being around small humans, when they first come out, they're all wobbly and loose, right? They're just like bags of flesh. That's really all they are. And as they're building their stance, my wife and I get to work over in the nursery once a month. And when we're over there, some of them are like on their way to walking. If you've ever been through that process before, the first thing that they learn how to do is to pull themselves up onto something and kind of do that, right? Have you seen this before? That's the picture that's being drawn by Jesus. Only it's not just one baby that's being held up by that thing. It's all things. Even the things that you think don't necessarily need to be held together and held up, Jesus is holding together all things. He has been before them all. He has held them all together. Let's look at verse 18. He's also the head of our body that we're referring to, the church. He's the ruler, the beginning, the firstborn from the dead, in order that it might be in all things that he holds preeminence. A word we don't necessarily use a whole lot anymore, but preeminence means that he might be found to be of the utmost importance. My friends, remember when I described the city of Colossae? And I described it hopefully in such a way that you can see how Truckee, California and Colossae have a whole lot in common. You and I, our attentions are going to be dragged in 400,000 different ways this week. And the enemy does not need to accomplish his means in our culture very often through these crazy, dark witchcraft, black things where people are being thrown against walls and floating through and exorcist heads spinning. Do you notice how you've probably never had that experience? You might. It still happens, but most of us will never have that experience. Why? Because it's too easy to just distract you. As long as we can help you avoid putting Jesus as the preeminent one, the one that is the most important place for your attention, he has succeeded. All I got to do is get you to worry about things, right? What am I going to eat? Not sure I'm making enough money. Why won't my kids be good? I'm not sure my boss likes me very much. What's that funny noise my car is making? What did I say to you that made you so mad at me? Why can't I look better? I don't know how to do this. Get so distracted, don't we? I get so distracted. I'm not pointing at you. I'm pointing at us. I can get so easily distracted by things that don't even matter sometimes. Paul, in the greatness of Jesus that he's trying to stick in front of us, wants to remind us that in all things, we're starting to lose vigor, that in all things, Jesus might be preeminent, the most important one, working in all of these situations. Notice I made it easy for you that time. Verse 19. He's capable of doing this, and he is worthy of being preeminent because it was in him that it was thought well for the fullness of God to dwell. If you were looking for a way to try to understand the God of the universe, you need look no farther than Jesus Christ. In him is the fullness of God dwelling in human form. His preeminence comes from the fact that he is fully God. More on this in a second. Finally, verse 20. His power is not just a creative power, but a redemptive power. Verse 20, through him to reconcile all things unto himself, making peace through the blood of his cross on his account, whether all things on earth or the things that are in heaven. We have a tendency to overlook, I have a tendency to overlook this verse right here and miss the power that is written here because I have had the honor and privilege of hearing the redemption story many times in my life. And if this is the first time or one of the first times that you're hearing it, it is a brilliant and beautiful story, and you need to spend your life trying to understand it. But sometimes with that familiarity, it can breed contempt. You've heard that phrase before. And sometimes we forget the beauty that lies in the simple idea that our Creator is also our Redeemer. You see, God made us in his image capable of creating things. You and I can build things, some of us better than others, right? But we have these stories that we tell ourselves. You familiar with this story? This guy here? That's not Herman Munster, although Herman Munster nobody even knows who Herman Munster is anymore. I'm giving you a little bit of my childhood this morning as we talk about the things that I used to watch. This is the depiction of Frankenstein's monster. And one of the powerful things about the Frankenstein story, remember, this was written at the beginning of the 1800s, and it was the opening of the horror genre. But what was brilliant about the story was not that this mad scientist could create an animate monster that was capable of living kind of a quasi-human life. But what was brilliant about the story was that he had enough creative power, but couldn't redeem that power for something good. The monster ends up being a significant problem, not just for him, but for the entire community around him. Dr. Frankenstein had creative power, but couldn't fix it if things went wrong. Maybe a more modern example, back to my childhood. You familiar with Calvin and Hobbes? If you're not, do yourself a favor and read the best comic strip that has ever existed in the history of mankind. Read Calvin and Hobbes. I have all of the books if you need to borrow them, okay? One at a time. Calvin creates for himself a duplicator. It's amazing what Calvin can do with a cardboard box. Initially, it was his transmogrifier, which is anybody with Calvin and Hobbes here? Okay, I don't know how much I have to explain it. The rest of you uncultured people, buckle your seatbelt. Calvin is capable of doing all kinds of amazing things with a cardboard box. And so his mom tells him he's going to need to clean his room. So he creates this box in which his plan is, I'll duplicate myself and enslave this individual to then get done all of the things that I need to get done so I can go on living my life. Here's the problem. Calvin created himself. The very one that was causing the problem to begin with. You can see where this could go. He had the creative power to build this duplicator, but unfortunately, not only does he first create an unruly 6-year-old that's now causing more problems than he was, and he's now getting in trouble for it, but then the unruly 6-year-old goes on to duplicate himself, and now we have 6 different Calvins running around wreaking havoc on Calvin's life. Fortunately, he's able to bring back his transmogrifier, change them into small worms, and free them into the environment. Sorry to spoil the ending for you there. Calvin had creative power, but he couldn't fix it when things started going wrong. This is a story we've told ourselves over and over and over again, and as a result, it sometimes gets lost on us how inadequate we are when we compare our creative power to that of God. And I'm not just talking about the beauty of a mountain range or a serene lake or a beautiful snowy day, whatever the case may be. Yes, we see God's beauty in those moments. But what is beautiful is when things started going wrong, he was capable of holding it back from the abyss and redeeming it and reconciling it all. Paul says elsewhere in his writings, the creation groans as it awaits for the return of Jesus. It's not just you and I who are waiting for Jesus to get back. It's the frogs, and it's the mountains, and it's the trees, and it's the rivers, because the creation, even if it could think, could notice that it's not necessarily supposed to be this way, but one day everything will get fixed again, and it will be a glorious and blissful eternity as we enjoy it all together. The brilliance of Jesus was not just that he could create, but that he could also reconcile and fix it when things started to go in a direction that we weren't ready for. I want to show you another thing that's within this text. And this may seem to be kind of like a little bit like Bible nerdy. So if you get totally freaked out by like Bible nerd stuff, just switch off for like the next 2 or 3 minutes and then join us again, okay? But one of the things that us Bible nerds have a tendency to catch sometimes are these literary devices that are used by writers in the Bible to emphasize points. I'm going to show you one that's referred to as a chiasm. I don't know if you've heard this term before. Again, if you're switched off, don't come back yet. We're just getting started. I want to show you a chiasm that exists in this text. I've drawn it out for you so you can kind of, it failed. Okay, so the things needs to be over. I don't know. Sorry. When it went up on the screen, it got all messed up. So imagine that the things is over. But here's what I want you to see here. Look at verses 13 and 14 as they talk about the Father's redemption, but then compare that down with verse 20. What do you notice there? Talking about Jesus' reconciliation and his redemption. Parallel points. Then you look at verse 15 and you look at 19. In 15, we're introduced to the idea that Jesus is the image of the invisible God. In verse 19, it's pointed out to us that the fullness of God dwelt in him. Parallel points. Then we look at verse 16 and 18, talking about how Jesus is the originator of all things. Don't forget your job, people. And that he is the ruler, that he is the head of all rulers, arches. And that word is then used again in verse 18, where he is the head of the body, and he is the ruler, arche. That term used in a parallel idea. which as a result, if this was looking correct, as a result would come to the point of our triangle in verse 17. Now, like I said, this is a little bit of a Bible nerdy thing, but the point of a chiasm, the way in which a chiasm is structured by a biblical author, is to drive home for you the center point. We create parallel points that progressively lead to the center point. So then, if we recognize that a chiasm exists, the key question that we need to ask ourselves, see what I did there? Punny. Is what we are supposed to be asking ourselves is that what's the most important point to draw out? It's in verse 17, so let's read it again. He is before or precedes or prior to all things. And all things hold together in him. What is the point? Jesus precedes and upholds all things. Friends, I know you're tired, so you can stop saying that phrase as I repeat it. The point is, I want you, when you leave this door and everything in your life starts confusing your mind and distracting you, and even worse, when difficulty starts to come into your life, I want you to remember that Jesus didn't just create all things, but holds together all things. He is at work in every single detail in your life. Whatever has happened, whatever does happen, whatever will happen, it is that way because Jesus has orchestrated it that way. Not just some things, not just part of the things, not just the things that make you feel churchy, all things. Whatever ecstasy you have, it is his blessing for your enjoyment. Enjoy it. Whatever pain you are enduring, it is his blessing to you for your strengthening. Whatever seems to make no sense in your life, it is his blessing to you for your growth. Whatever direction you may follow, he's actually working in the background and accomplishing his purposes, even while you thought you were making the decisions to take the steps you're taking. He is at work in all things. As a result, I'm going to invite the band to come back up so that we can prepare to respond back to him, but I want to leave you with this thought. If you would live a life of wisdom, if you would find fulfillment, if you would know peace in your life, you must direct yourself and your mind to what sits at the core of all things. Jesus, who loves you, who reconciles you, who is redeeming you through his blood and drawing you into his greatness. Do yourself a favor this week. Seek him. Seek to understand him. Seek to know him deeply. Seek to emulate him in your unique circumstances. Worship him. For he has created all things and upholds all things. And one day, all things will turn and worship him again as the Lord that he is. Let's get a head start on it now.